We've heard today that there have been some developments regarding Yahya Sinwa, who is the Hamas-Gaza chief. What can you tell us about that situation?
Well, Yahya Sinwar and Mohammed Deif and many other senior Hamas terrorists are wanted men. They're dead men walking, and it's a matter of time before we get our hands on them. They are a very important part, perhaps even crucial, to the Hamas regime in Gaza. And since our goals in this war are to dismantle Hamas and get rid of Hamas once and for all, then getting our hands on Yahya Sinwar is very important. Our troops are now operating in the hometown of Yahya Sinwar. We are near the location of his house, and based on the understanding that obviously he's probably not staying in his house 60 days after the war started, we are operating above and below ground in order to get our hands on him and other senior Hamas terrorists.
So the assumption then, as Prime Minister Netanyahu said, and also Admiral Hagari, I think, said a little bit earlier, the operating assumption is that he's underground. Is there anything you can share about the whereabouts without giving that away? I know that's difficult to do.
Yeah, we know that all Hamas seniors, they hide underneath the civilian population. Usually, the more senior, the deeper they go. They have special tunnels protected deep underground where the most senior terrorists are. And Hamas and Yahya Sinwar is very senior, the most senior Hamas terrorist in Gaza. So one can assume, and we're working under the assumption, that it will be a hard target to find. But in the end, we will find him, whether it is troops or by reaching his location with other types of ordnance and means. At the end of the day, at the end of this war, we will either capture or kill him.
Lieutenant Colonel Conricus, you've been instrumental in demonstrating to us in the press since this conflict began, at least at this level, some of the tactics and a lot of the tools and spaces that Hamas and its terrorists have utilized in this campaign. When you say that he's one of the seniors and he's probably deeper underground, I know you've said before that some of these tunnels may go several stories below ground. Do you have an estimate on how deep these things may go?
Yeah, to explain that, then I'll give a little bit of a longer answer. There's different levels of tunnels in Gaza. There are short tactical combat tunnels, which Hamas operatives use in order to relocate themselves tactically within the battlefield so that they can emerge in an alley or in the backside of a house, emerge, engage with our troops, usually firing RPGs towards our tanks, and then disappear back into the tunnel into relative safety, only to appear on the other side of the street or in a different house. Hamas has a lot of those tunnels, and we have exposed many of those tunnels as our troops have been advancing in northern Gaza and in other areas of the Gaza Strip. Actually, we're talking about that we have exposed more than 800 tunnel shafts of different sizes and different purposes. We have destroyed more than 500 of them. We've dismantled, and there's still a few that we are investigating and learning from. The other type of tunnel would be the long endurance or long time span location tunnel, where Hamas operatives simply use that as a bunker, which allows them to stay underground away from Israeli Air Force bombs and basically to live and operate and run operations from there. And these are typically the tunnels that battalion commanders and brigade commanders have at their disposal. They are typically located underneath civilian neighborhoods, preferably, according to Hamas structure, under densely populated neighborhoods, lots of civilians above. And we've seen that in Jabalia, in Shati, in Zaytun, and in many other locations. Many of those have been targeted by the IDF, and many of those indeed today are filled with soil, rubble, and lots of bodies of dead Hamas terrorists. And the third type of tunnel would be the smuggling tunnels that go in from Egypt towards Gaza, towards Rafah, which are intended, of course, to bring in all of the weapons that Hamas has been able to stockpile over the years. Yahya Sinwar, we can assume, he and other seniors is hiding in deep tunnels. We're talking about dozens of feet below the ground, maybe even 100 feet below the ground. It depends on the location and how close they are to groundwater, but they are very deep, the tunnels. And the deeper they are, the more protected they are from aerial ordnance, aerial bombardment. And we know that Yahya Sinwar takes his security very seriously, and I think is quite disciplined when it comes to staying underground and continuously hiding from our operations.
One of the things, speaking of underground in these tunnels, we heard a couple of days ago that there was some thought being given to using seawater to flood these tunnels. Is that a viable option? Is that something that's being considered?
Yeah, we're looking at different tactical solutions to deal with this challenge. I know that other militaries have dealt with tunnels on the battlefield, and of course, it's not new to us. We've seen it in Lebanon, we've seen it in Gaza before, but the scope and the amount of tunnels and how elaborate the tunnel system is, and how well it facilitates the movement and the existence of enemy combatants, it's quite a challenge. And for that, we're looking at various means how to, instead of having those tunnels as a challenge, how to turn that into a challenge and a deficit for the enemy, and basically turn them into mass graves. And there's more than one way to do that. You referenced one of them, but it's not the only one. And we're looking at different technological solutions. We're also learning as we go. We're experimenting with different solutions, different ways of dealing with the tunnels. There's the old tested and proven way of simply blowing the tunnels up or blowing the shafts up and making the tunnels basically inaccessible. And then there's other ways as well. I think at the end of the war, probably we will be able to expose some of the techniques that we've been using in order to deal with this very elaborate tunnel network that Hamas obviously has spent hundreds of millions of dollars in working on over the years. By the way, all of the cement that has been poured into these tunnels and holds the tunnels up, basically the structure, all of that cement is international aid that was intended to build roads and schools and hospitals and mosques for the people of Gaza. Hamas has diverted that and uses it in order to build their infrastructure.
And speaking of the efforts that you're putting out to address the threat that these Hamas terrorists pose in Gaza and beyond, give us a sense, if you will, of what your operational posture is now, since the hostage releases for now have been ended and essentially you're back in an operational combat mode.
Yeah, we still have 138 Israeli hostages being held by Hamas. 81 Israeli hostages have been released in total. And we have women, children, men, elderly people, civilians and military, both women and men, being held by Hamas. Every day that goes by, their situation deters. We know that there are some of the civilians there that are being held hostage are in urgent need of medical attention. And I think it's an atrocity that international aid organizations, specifically the Red Cross, have not yet either been able to or been adamant enough in order to gain access to those hostages and provide them with what they are entitled to under international humanitarian law, medical attention, and to see how their situation is. And we continue fighting. There's the situation on the ground where we are operating in northern Gaza, still with a lot of troops, and continue to engage the enemy and deal blow after blow to the Hamas infrastructure. And we have continued and expanded operations in southern Gaza. We will complete operations once Hamas surrenders or is totally defeated. And once we can verify that there is no military threat emanating from Gaza towards Israeli civilians, and to make sure, of course, that the October 7th massacre never happens again. And of course, at the end of the day, we are committed to getting all of our hostages back, be it through diplomacy or through other means. At the end of this war, they must all be returned back to Israel. That is our commitment and part of our mission.
More brief questions. We heard yesterday and the day before as well about some horrific mutilations of women who were raped and mutilated in many different ways. And I know this is hard for people to listen to, but I think it's important if you could share some insight into what took place, just briefly.
Yeah, there's first-hand testimonies of survivors, both from the Nova Music Festival and from Israeli communities, who basically tell first-hand testimonies of what they saw. A gang rape of 8 or 10 Hamas terrorists that were raping a young Israeli woman. And after they finished raping her, they shot her in the head. And many examples, very graphic, and I'm sorry that I have to say this, of body parts of women that were cut off, breasts, of gunfire towards the genitals of women, and extremely horrible sights, all documented by first responders, medical staff, and by volunteers who came there in order to collect bodies and bring them to burial. And there's a very large investigation going on, led by the Israeli police, that is concentrating or collecting all of these testimonies and all of the evidence. And the terrorists that we were able to apprehend in Israel are going to be brought for trial by the Israeli authorities for what they did. And I think it is very important that people actually hear about it. It's being kind of brushed aside because the things happening in Gaza are probably more dramatic, and the visuals are more dramatic, and dead victims don't speak. Our dead, raped, and mutilated women do not speak because they were murdered. And therefore, I think you're right, and it is important to speak about it. And it's important that institutions around the world, like UN Women and other organizations that allegedly care for the rights of women and act in order to prevent sexual violence, speak up and act accordingly.
Last thing, what message do you share, considering your ongoing operations in Gaza? What message would you share to the people of Gaza, the innocent people there? What do you say to them?
I say that we understand that they are suffering and that times are difficult. We understand that many of them are in a difficult position. They've been displaced from their homes and they're going through difficult times. We understand that. They are not our enemy, and we did not launch a war out of context. We did it because we were attacked from Gaza by Hamas, and Hamas is the enemy. We will continue to try our best to prevent any harm done to Palestinian civilians that are not part of the fighting and not affiliated with Hamas. We will continue to warn ahead in the areas that we're going to operate to give them enough time to evacuate. We will continue to distinguish in the best possible way between combatant and non-combatant, and we will continue to facilitate the flow of humanitarian aid into Gaza in order to care for the needs of those civilians. Hopefully, at the end of this war, it will be a much better situation for them, the people of Gaza, because we will rid them of this horrible terror organization that has been governing Gaza for 17 years. And in a few years' time, I am hopeful that the situation in Gaza can and will be much better, first and foremost for us, for our security, but also for the civilians living in Gaza.
Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, the spokesman for the Israeli Defense Forces. Thank you, sir, for your time.
Thank you for having me.